So, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second webinar on the Energy Transition Series organized by the CTA, the Alumni Association of the Masters and Diploma in Commodity Trading of the University in Geneva, and the JP Morgan Center for Commodities at the University of Colorado in Denver Business School. I'm Alessandro Sanos, the Global Director for Commodities Sales Strategy at Refinitiv, part of the London Stock Exchange Group. Today, we will be exploring an aspect of the energy transition that I believe it does not receive enough mainstream attention. And I'm talking about metals. The energy transition requires substantial amount of metals such as copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, and anything shiny in general. Metals are needed to expand the grid, to build batteries, cables, and everything else that will support the electrification of the economy. So the question is, do we have enough metals, and are metals a bottleneck for the energy transition? Before we start, allow me to quickly present you today's speakers. We have Professor Roderick Eggert, the Coulter Foundation Chair in Mineral Economics at the Colorado School of Mines and Deputy Director of the Critical Materials Institutes. And we also have David Hammond, the Principal Mineral Economist at Hammond International Group. So without further ado, let me open the discussion by asking our speakers, what is the fundamental problem with critical minerals relative to the energy transition? Could you give us a feel of the scale of the problem? Roderick, shall we start with you?
Okay. Well, David and I thought that we would begin with two figures to help set the stage, figures from an International Energy Agency study that was released about a year ago called Critical Minerals or Critical Materials for the Energy Transitions to try to set the stage for the rest of our discussion. Let me share my screen and put it into presenter mode. And are you looking at the full screen, or do I need to swap displays?
It's a full screen, thank you.
Okay, so we have materials for the energy transitions, and here's one figure from this study.
On this, and by the way, this is one of the few comprehensive studies that's been made in the last year or so, trying to quantify what the amount of materials and what the associated issues are, i.e. where are those materials coming from. But this is probably the best slide for showing, trying to illustrate the magnitude of the problem. On this, and I'll walk you through it real quick, we have on the right-hand side a list of the materials that are critical to energy transition. And if we look at what we're trying to show here is the comparison about the amount of materials that are required for the different applications, power generation and transport that are the part and parcel of the green energy transition. So the first one is transport. And what you can see here is kilograms per vehicle of these critical materials. Top electric car, bottom conventional car. And you can see that while conventional cars rely heavily on copper and manganese, the electric car has many other additional metals that are required in the manufacture, plus the amounts, the quantities in kilograms are quite large. If we go to the power generation in the bottom here, and this is kilograms per megawatt hour of capacity. The illustration there from natural gas on the bottom up through solar, photovoltaic, onshore wind, and offshore wind shows the amounts of kilograms of materials, of these materials that are required to construct the capacity. And the renewables, of course, are taking enormous additional quantities than to establish the same capacity with, say, natural gas or coal. This is really, orders of magnitude, really, that you're looking at as far as the quantities of materials that are going to be required. Those of us who spend our lives in the mining industry are really scratching our heads of where these are going to come from. In lithium, for example, we're looking at in order to achieve the climate goals that have been established by the EU, the United States, the climate initiatives, we're looking at sevenfold additional expansion of production capacity within a very short time frame, say between 2030 and 2040. Then but the associated problem with this, and beyond even the geopolitical, what Rod is going to talk about, is this impact on cost, the expense of creating the network of production with renewables is going to be a lot more expensive than what has been anticipated over, say, the last decade.
So to I would say, put the message of this slide, or try to put it succinctly, the question is, will supply grow adequately to meet what certainly will be significantly increased demand? And it's not just adequately in terms of kilograms or tons, but it's affordably in terms of costs, sustainably in terms of increased production in ways that are considered to be environmentally appropriate, with appropriate environmental safeguards, and in socially acceptable ways, given the often significant social disruptions and challenges associated with making mining and processing consistent with local communities and their values. So, will supply grow appropriately, sufficiently, affordably, sustainably? And then the second slide focuses on the issue of security of supply. So, in addition to growing sufficiently, will supply be secure? And this figure, also from the same IEA study, we've labeled, it's about supply chains, not just mining. And what this figure shows, again, with horizontally oriented bar charts, are the share of world production accounted for by the top 3 countries. So it's country concentration, not company concentration, which is obviously slightly different. And so on the left-hand side, we have the extraction stage, or the resource production stage. And at the top, we have fossil fuels, oil and natural gas. The top 3 producing countries represent 40-ish% of world production. If we look at the materials critical for many of the energy transition technologies, copper, nickel, cobalt, rare earths, and lithium, you see that the combined market shares of the top 3 countries is larger in each case. In the case of copper, not so much larger than for oil and natural gas, but as you go from nickel to cobalt to rare earths to lithium, much greater geographic concentration of production. If we then move to the midstream or intermediate processing, what happens after typically what occurs at the mining stage, we again compare fossil fuels, oil refining, and LNG exports at the top of the figure, which account for anywhere between the top three countries account for anywhere between 40 to roughly 55%. And then when we move down to the same metals, copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earths, and we see that the market share of the top three countries is higher, and again, in some cases, significantly higher than is true for fossil fuels. So there's the issue of a single point of failure or a small number of points of failure that raise the issue of security of supply, which is not so much an issue, in my view, over the next 20 or 30 years, but is especially important if we think about the next several years, up to 3, 4, 5 years, up to perhaps a decade. So we have the longer term consideration over several decades of time about supply growing adequately and affordably and sustainably. And then over the short to medium term, we have the issue of security of supply that relates to the geographically concentrated production. So that's our setting of the stage. Let me stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Alessandro.
Thank you, Roderick. It's a very interesting slide because I think it really summarizes all this geographical concentration risk, which we talk a lot in the energy space, but a little bit less in the metal industry. There was a lot of red on the graph on the right. But moving on, what would be the most serious obstacles to solving the metals challenge? Do you believe it can be solved in a timely fashion to meet the energy transition goals, knowing that from the moment that, as an example, a copper mine gets approval to the moment it's delivered, there can be 35 years time gap. So what can we do about that?
Well, there's several dimensions to it, and there really are more than just a handful of factors that go in this. The first thing I think is looking at known resources. What is the size of that? What is the timeliness of the availability of these resources being developed and brought to market? And we'll just take lithium as an example. Currently, recently, the world production of lithium of all forms, but perhaps expressed in the equivalence of lithium carbonate, 1 million tons a year at a current demand level will be, or is forecast to meet the needs of energy transition, to expand perhaps certainly up to 2 million tons over the next few years. And by 2035, we may be looking at a demand of 3.5 million tons per year. As you go further out in time, this is, of course, very conditional to the changes in the battery technology that is being employed. And given that, in view of the fact lithium prices have increased from $1,000 ton up to a recent quote of in the neighborhood of $70,000 a ton, that's certainly going to be a spur to innovation and trying to identify more cost-effective battery technologies that also be more efficient in the way they extend mileage of electrical vehicles. So where is all that material going to come from, given the level of known resources? It looks like, no question, that there's going to be a requirement for new resources to be developed. And then when you go into this, looking at new resources, as you mentioned, Alessandro, the exploration, permitting, development timeframe of new mineral resources has been becoming increasingly more lengthy. Exploration for any mineral commodity is a high risk game, and the probability of one prospect or mineralized mineral opportunity to actually be carried through exploration, development, and mine is very, very low. 1 out of 1,000 geologic concepts that actually result in a producing mine would be kind of what the realities of the industry are. But to get through that process, obviously, you've got to look at a lot of exploration opportunities, but the process of exploration is not measured in months. It's measured in years and oftentimes in decades. And if you look at some political jurisdictions, such as the United States, the time once you have found something to bring it to a mineable stage is that we have examples where here in the U.S. that are currently in progress, that they've been looked at for 15 to 20 years. They're still in a permitting stage, which going forward still might never result in a mine because of obstacles to blocking. So the time frame for bringing these resources on and the limited size of new resources is very, very problematic in my mind.
And David, can I probably ask you a follow-up question? Because if we look at government policies and we think of the Paris Agreement, COP26, and everybody trying to accelerate the transition, I'm seeing a gap or a disconnect between what would like to achieve on the emission side with what can be achieved on the metal side, which will be basically the enabler of the transition. What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's definitely a disconnect on the availability of the materials required for transition. And it's been people, as you have said in your introduction, I agree full well. It's not recognized by the great number of policymakers and a lot of the participants, the lead agencies that are in the transition to green energy, manufacturers, the developers of renewable resources. They to date have not really grappled with this problem. They currently, over the last year or so, I think it's become they have realized they have an issue on there, and you see some of the leaders like Elon Musk starting to get involved with the upstream production of these critical materials to ensure that the supply they see they'll need will be there. However, it's still, in my mind, a very limited involvement. And part of that goes back to just the fact the minerals industry is difficult for people who are not in it to understand it. And the buildup of the technical staff, the expertise that a Tesla would need to create productive investments in this sector. It's not an overnight proposition. And that begs the next question, which I'm sure most people, and perhaps the audience here, doesn't realize. We have a shortage of expertise in the mining sector. people in the minerals industry, in the education, and I'm sure Rod sees this. I do as a accreditation commissioner for engineering and science. The enrollments in mining engineers, students pursuing a mining engineering degree, have decreased substantially all over the world. Going into a career in mining is not considered socially favorable. So this leads to we currently have it, and for the next certainly 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a shortage of the people who will be at the tip of the spear to bring these new resources online. Metallurgists, mining engineers, geologists, geophysicists, and also skilled trades for the mining, particularly in the underground sector, which I feel we will increasingly be faced with over the next 50 years, more underground mining as opposed to open pit or surface, and even down to the trades, the skilled trades that you need to create, to build mines and to produce them.
Alessandro, if I might respond to both of your questions. The first one, meeting the challenges of providing the materials needed for the emerging energy technologies, and second of all, the role for public policy. With respect to meeting the challenge, thinking a little more broadly, there are really 3 fundamental ways to meet the material requirements. 1, produce more. 2, waste less. And 3, use less. And I've found it useful to organize responses and in turn policies around these 3 categories. So they produce more and produce more in a diversified way is a challenge for primary production, mining, and subsequent processing. And clearly, there are workforce challenges. There are scientific challenges, technological challenges that could help solve the problem if we could reduce energy inputs, reduce environmental impacts, and reduce costs of production. But it's not just producing more. There are opportunities to meet the challenges through wasting less, through improved manufacturing efficiency, improved and enhanced reuse and recycling. So there's the waste less knob that one can turn. And there's finally the use less knob to turn, which would focus on developing substitute technologies and substitute materials for those that are at greatest risk of being unavailable in ways that to meet the energy challenges. And I would say it's going to be a combination of all 3, producing more, wasting less, and using less, and which is most important will vary somewhat from circumstance to circumstance or material to material. Now, in terms of your second question, the role for public policy, I would say that the very interesting evolution of policy over the last decade has moved from what I would call traditional roles of government, and a market-based solution through what some people call neoliberalism, to today, what is being re-embraced after several decades of being out of favor is industrial policy, national industrial policy to speed up the market. Markets work efficiently, but they are chaotic and they work slowly. And there's growing sentiment in favor of national governments and national alliances across governments of working together to produce more, waste less, and use less among, I would say, allied and friendly countries through things like loan guarantees, loans, co-financing of productive capabilities, co-financing partly public, partly private, to speed the development of new facilities outside of the risky areas faster than would occur more naturally if it were left entirely to the market. And it's a big philosophical debate, the degree to which to rely on markets versus have a bit more government direction.
Can I ask a question, a follow-up question? Sorry, David. On the aspect of the private and public working together, would that, in your opinion, reduce a little bit the big geographical concentration risk?
I think that to some degree that is beginning to happen and will need to happen to a greater extent. So just to pick an example, one could imagine the European Union, Canada, the United States, Australia, and Japan, for example, and maybe others, working together to establish, say, a supply chain for lithium or for something else that would create not just more supply, but more diverse supply than exists at the moment. So maybe we have lithium hard rock mining in Australia that is processed in Japan or the United States and then converted into battery cathode material in somewhere else and assembled into electric vehicles in all the locations around the world that assemble electric vehicles.
And that approach, which I've heard somewhat termed in a general sense as friend shoring, as opposed to offshoring or reshoring, is actually in progress at a small scale today with rare earth materials produced in Australia, targeted for processing at a facility in the United States. The issue I see is the speed with which some of these arrangements, agreements, industrial policy provisions can be put in place. One thing that has been floating around in the U.S. in the rare earth sector has been the concept of establishing a cooperative between involving a lot of the ultimate consumers, automobile companies, electronics, defense industry, as a cooperative to build the centralized processing facility that Rod illustrated. Again, idea has been around for a number of years, but it doesn't seem to get traction, particularly at the governmental level. I think because of what Rod said, the governmental, certainly in the U.S. and I think to a large extent in the EU, are waiting for the market to solve the problem. And as Rod said, the market can be very efficient, but it can move very, very slowly. Another issue that I see with the governmental policy, mineral policies, industrial policies, is while those sectors can be addressed through governmental and industrial action, we still have a lot of opposition to mining, which that has become, I think, and with much justification, more concern as time has gone on. Once you speed up through the changes in industrial policy or governmental policy, you still are going to have the opposition on the social sector. And again, it's not that there's ways to get around it. There's ways to solve the issues, to address them, but it stretches out the time frame. And the time frame of getting all these things in place to address the situation, that's what gives me the most heartburn. It's just the reality of how our world works. And of course, much complexed by the war in Ukraine right now and the longer term repercussions from that as to how mineral commodity supply will change. To me, it just doesn't line up. The changes that are needed here just doesn't line up with the environmental goals that the climate change has really put in place. The number of electric vehicles that we're targeting that are forecast to come online. To me, we've got a problem that doesn't mesh right now, time-wise.
Yes, I agree. I agree with you. There is a big gap right now. And I think that we really need to bring it into the open, because I do believe that is a sort of a blind spot right now. You mentioned the friendshoring, and I agree with you as well on this one. It seems that we're entering into a geopolitical phase of trading blocks rather than a full-blown globalization. And you also mentioned Russia. Russia is a big producer, but if they're coming off the supply chain of the West, this will have a repercussion on the supply chains of the rest of the world. What would be your view on this?
Well, I think there are short-term and long-term consequences that are slightly different. If we think about the Russia, focusing specifically on Russia and the Ukraine, the near-term potential disruptions are to those materials that are produced and or processed in those parts of the world. So we're thinking about potash for its use in fertilizers. It's things like nickel for its use in batteries, not to mention specialty steels. But longer term, I think the consequences could be broader in the sense of speeding the transition to greater regionalization, not full deglobalization, but a bit more regionalization of raw material supply chains. And we need to look no further than U.S. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen's speech a week or so ago, when she, in a public speech, referred to realigning trade among countries that share similar values. And I'm not sure, she maybe used the term friendshoring. I'm not sure whether she did or not. But this is from someone who, like me, comes out of a lifetime of experience that has emphasized the benefits of greater rather than lesser globalization. We locate activities where costs are lowest, and because transportation costs have been reasonably low, at least in historical terms, for the last several decades compared to 100 years ago, and because communications is so much more efficient across large regions, it's made sense to develop much more fragmented supply chains, even with parts of supply chains located in countries with which we don't agree on all issues. And so I think the longer term impact of Russia and the Ukraine will be to quicken or speed up this search for a new equilibrium that won't focus so much on national self-sufficiency, but on regionalization or friendshoring, whatever one wants to call it.
I would agree with that 100%. Another aspect, and this is longer term, on the new supply of a lot of these critical materials, is that a person also has to look at where is the mineral potential, and just not from a geologic standpoint, that the terrain is permissive, that this is a good place to explore, but also from the standpoint of being able to construct the facilities that you need to produce the materials. And in my mind, Russia is one of the remaining unexplored pieces of the planet that has a lot of remaining mineral potential. It has just not been located yet. It's highly prospective from that standpoint, and probably a little more permissive, at least historically, in being able to construct the facilities. If you look at some of the Western world countries like the United States, from a regulatory standpoint, and this has been my 50-year career in here, it's very doubtful you'll be able to construct, first of all, explore for, and then find and being able to construct a productive new mine due to the political and social policies that have evolved. Again, some rightly so, but others basically obstruction. So we're kind of, from a socio-political perspective, when we go to, maybe it's, instead of globalization, regionalization of the supply demand of materials of all sorts. I think right now we have a lot of potentially prospective areas that are going to be out of limits, that are going to be off the chart of possible areas. Will that change with time as more people realize that in order to accomplish our climate change goals, mining is going to have to occur? And that concept is still a long ways from being understood and accepted by the general population, and particularly the politicians and the media.
So what would be the impact on commodity trading?
Well, I think you've got some great opportunities ahead of yourselves. I think commodity trading is going to get more challenging once you've moved beyond the kind of the standard copper, aluminum, the things that commodity traders have long been familiar with. As you move to, I'll use the term minor metals, what we find is it requires a lot more research and understanding of those particular commodity sectors. So I think commodity traders, as they expand their portfolios, are going to have to get a lot more smarter from the technical standpoint of where these individual things come from, what are the issues that are associated with the processing and the bringing to a useful product form. And they're going to have to deal with things they're probably not used to, such as a lot of these metals don't have transparent markets. And instead of many producers, such as copper, you're probably going to have just a few suppliers. Also, the volumes that are involved, while they're going to grow substantially, are still relatively small compared to how much copper or aluminum is produced and consumed in the globe every year. So more research is certainly going to be an understanding is going to be a necessity of commodity traders who are successful.
Now, I might just add on to that. I'm not expert in the history of commodity trading, but my impression is that a value that commodities traders provided, say, 50 years ago, was insight into markets that were not transparent. That was actually their role, was to link end users and producers that didn't know about each other or didn't know the institutional details. And I would say there is the 1950s like opportunity for commodity traders today in these minor metal markets, which require the institutional knowledge that one can't get simply by spending a weekend doing online research. Now, I guess the second answer I would have to the question of opportunities for commodity traders, I think increasingly the end users, not customers like all of us, but the automobile companies, the phone handset manufacturers, the manufacturers of white goods and wind turbines and solar panels, because of the supply chain disruptions generally over the last couple of years, have become much more concerned about securing their own supply chains. They really don't want to have to vertically integrate backward to mining because they have no expertise in mining. And I think commodity traders can provide this the service of helping to link the end users, the original equipment manufacturers with the raw material producers, so that the automobile companies don't need to become specialists in lithium production, for example.
I would agree 100%. That would be a great opportunity, but it is going to require commodity traders to really get smart about the particular commodity that they are trading. I think more to a degree, more so than what they've had to, the level they need to of knowledge that they've had to attain for commodity trading in the past.
And let me say that my comment about commodity traders and the opportunities in opaque markets, here I'm speaking about commodity traders involved in the buying and selling of physical commodities, which is really quite a different activity than commodity trading using financial instruments, futures and options and related contracts.
The physical versus the paper.
Correct, yeah.
I agree. In the meantime, I would like to encourage the audience to use the little chat on the screen to ask questions for Roderick and David. Let me ask you probably a question. So let me open the Q&A session, conscious of time. Let me ask you the first question. Would you have any recommendation, whether it is policy or otherwise, that could help addressing this metals challenge?
Well,
who wants to start?
That's a tough one. I think for a country like the United States, one of the things that really needs to happen is establishment of a formal mineral policy, national mineral policy. Here in the United States, we've never really had that. I'm not familiar with the EU as a whole. They may be a little more advanced on that. A policy that kind of sets the goals, objectives, and the parameters around what we need to do. Education of, again, the stakeholders in the green energy transition, all of them, about the role that these materials play in accomplishing the transition, and the volumes that are going to be required, and the realities that go along with obtaining those volumes. I think that's very important. And I think that certainly from the industry side, even though we have complained about that people just don't understand what's going to be needed here, we haven't made, us in the industry haven't really made the effort to an appropriate effort or a productive effort to get that accomplished. I know I've spent certainly the last 3 years just on the rare earth sector trying to educate government policymakers and staffers, media, and about the realities of where rare earths are, what are they, what they're needed, where they're going to come from, what are the issues in bringing them to market. So education and effective policy, I think, would be the two suggestions I'd have.
Roderick?
I would, to what David said, I would add an aspect of technology policy. And I would say I'm a technological optimist in the sense that innovation can help us reduce costs as well as environmental consequences of mineral and materials production. And I'm thinking not just about basic research, but a little more government involvement in the gap that often exists between basic curiosity-driven research and commercialization. Good ideas often die because there's not enough attention paid to taking a good idea that's been demonstrated in the laboratory and putting it through pilot scale and demonstration scale, the scaling up and testing and vetting process. When you increase the size and introduce real world as opposed to controlled laboratory experiments. Now I see that Erica Hyman has posted a question in chat.
Yes.
And I note that because I have an answer to that.
So let me read it out for the audience who may be driving or not have access to the chat. So the question from Erica is, why has the West effectively outsourced the processing of critical minerals to China?
My simple answer is that it's an example of the benefits, at least to the moment, of globalization. Benefits in the sense that China, for whatever reason, has been willing to supply many of the critical minerals and materials at lower cost than would be available elsewhere in the world. And in part, that has been because of lower labor costs, although that's less true today. In part, it, in some circumstances, is due to weaker environmental rules. In part, it's been due to low-cost finance for significant capital investments, and it's been part of it's been a strategic priority of the Chinese government to become more of a manufacturing nation.
And I would add to that, it's part of Chinese long-term thinking. If you want to go back 30 years, they had an understanding of the role some of these, or at least a belief, the role some of these critical materials would play in future energy, defense, other electronic applications. And they made it a priority to understand and establish the infrastructure that would be needed to advance applications and the supply of these materials. Whereas in the Western world, particularly the United States, we don't have that long-term thinking, or if we have the thinking, we don't have the commitment to realize or move forward over the time frames that sometimes it takes to bring new technologies, new ideas to fruition. So in using rare earths as an example, 30 years ago, the U.S. was really a key supplier of the really small quantities of rare earths that were necessary. And we kind of let just not the technology for processing rare earth materials to the next stage of usability, or in the next stage, the technology for producing products from them, the fabrication magnets and rare earth alloys and everything. Well, that technology really was acquired by the Chinese. We also let our education or our scientific understanding and capability for research in this area to deteriorate. And we are building it back now, but this is kind of the way the world really worked in conjunction with the globalization, but also due to a very well-defined industrial policy for some of these critical materials that the Chinese adopted.
Which goes back to what you were saying earlier, David, of the lack in the US and the EU, partially, of a long-term planning and strategy and policy.
Yes.
So playing for the long term, for the long win, instead of the electoral cycle of 4 years.
Correct. Yes. Or the next quarter of reporting earnings.
Correct. I saw a question in the chat. It's a comment and a question. So George is saying, okay, what happens if the big producers outside of China will need to merchandise a significant part of their products in the Chinese market to be able to remain sustainable? So what happens if, can they compete with domestic suppliers from China?
I think George is absolutely correct. For many of the critical minerals, the major market is manufacturing companies in China. And so a significant barrier to entry for many potential producers outside of China is who will be their market. And if all electric motors, for example, or most electric motors are manufactured in China, then a producer of magnets, rare earth permanent magnets for electric motors, will of necessity need to sell into the Chinese market. And so it's an open question. I don't think there's a simple yes or no answer, but the reality is that China, it may be a bit of an exaggeration or an overgeneralization, has become the world's manufacturing location. And minerals ultimately are used, mineral-based materials, in manufacturing of things.
And the Chinese, they don't really care where the materials the metals originally come from. The ores, what part of the world, the concentrates that are produced from those ores, what they care about is getting that material to China for second step onward processing, conversion to usable forms, and then used in the manufacturing of the products that contain these critical materials. That's what they want to sell, the value added. Mining, to them, it's a messy business. We don't really need to be totally involved in that, although they have established a mining presence throughout the world, particularly in Africa during the last couple decades. So that's their policy, is to bring the raw materials to China for onward fabrication.
But let's be clear, all of us as consumers benefit from low cost or products that are lower cost than they would be if they were not manufactured in China. There's a reason the lower costs benefit all of us as customers. And that's one of the tensions with globalization versus regionalization.
The thing between is cost of the supply. That's my main concern, or security of supply, as we go through an evolution of the geopolitical environment.
And if we take this one step further, is actually the cost of the energy transition, because we all want a better planet, but I'm not really sure that everybody realizes that it's going to be a more expensive planet.
That plus, I have a real problem with a lot of Western world thinking when it comes to how do we clean up the atmosphere, how do we stop further deterioration. We have a lot of people in the world, in the very populous nations, and they're rapidly expanding populated areas such as Africa, India. And while their consumption while their per capita outflow or contribution to global climate change on in whatever the greenhouse gas is small on a per capita basis, well, it can become significant as the population grows and as their desire for standards of living increase, which increases the intensity of use of energy. But right now, I don't think they have the same appreciation and concern about climate change and greenhouse gases that we have in the Western world. And that to me is a dichotomy that I think people need to think about.
And ensure that the transition will be just, to avoid squashing entire countries and communities.
Yeah.
So I think that probably this brings this virtual event to a close. We have just really past the hour. I would really like to thank the audience for joining this webcast, but also you, David and Roderick, for sharing your insight. So thank you very much and stay safe.